Wireless data. It's what connects us to just about everything. And full power licensed spectrum is how it gets from point A to point B. Americans will use 5 times more 5G data by 2027. To make sure all Americans benefit from secure, reliable 5G networks, we need more full power licensed spectrum. Go to more5gspectrum.com to learn more.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, my good friend? How are you?
Chilling, man. As per usual. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm coming off some type of respiratory infection or something like that. So my voice, I think it's back to normal right now, but it might sound a little differently. I might sound a little nasally, like I have asthma or something.
Well, for first-time listeners, they won't know the difference, but I think you sound fine.
Yeah, I think
for
I'm
what it's
good.
worth.
But how's it going, brother? How are you?
You know, just hanging in as usual. Just trying to figure out if we've hit the event horizon for AI taking over the world, or if aliens are a thing because we've been shooting them down left and right over our skies. Like, I don't know. It's a lot of interesting things happening right now, and let's just say I'm glad that we have something to distract us, aka our podcast, because otherwise.
Well, the funny thing is, this podcast is entirely recorded by AI.
Yeah.
So
we're not even real.
The secret is that Danny and I are both the origins of Chat GPT. We are the Genesis. We are the what's in the show Westworld. What was the main character's name? The one of the lead scientist, was it Harold Oswald?
It was.
This is gonna kill me.
Yeah, now we gotta Google this.
Now I can't let this go because Anthony Hopkins keeps on saying his name over and over again, and Arnold. Is it Arnold? That's right?
It. Yep, it's definitely we are Arnold.
Arnold. And what was the girl's name? Was it Luann?
Dorothy.
Man,
was it Dorothy? No.
Man,
I forget. They pulled it off the HBO, and now I don't know shit about it anymore.
Cast. Man, I'm sorry for this, but this is just things that we cannot. Dolores. No, it's not Arnold. We're both wrong. It's Bernard.
No, Arnold was the person that Bernard was modeled after.
Oh,
right. Okay. He's the guy that the old dude was trying to chase down the rabbit hole. You know what I mean?
I gotcha. Now it's all coming back to me. Now the whole story is coming back to me right now. It's been a while since I've seen that.
That show is fucking phenomenal, and they canceled it, and then they pulled it off of HBO, and now it's going to be on some like third-party streaming service somewhere.
I wonder why. When that show first came out, 7 years ago? It's been a while. Everyone was talking about that. It was like, yo, have you seen Westworld? Have you seen Westworld? Have you seen the ending?
I mean, it was like the thing that came out in between Game of Thrones seasons, you know?
Yeah, that was it. That was the it was the guy who played that weird twin in Always Sunny in Philadelphia is the man in the thin I don't want to do a spoiler, but whatever, I'll spoil it. The man in the black hat ends up being the McNulty twin from Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Yep. Sorry if you haven't watched it yet, and I spoiled that for you. But
it's been years.
It's been years. There's a certain time limit. But yeah, going back to our original point, we don't care about spoilers because we're API. Or API. We're
just AI.
We're not API. We're AI. We're artificial.
We're such good AI that we're bad at talking about AI.
We're a language processing unit recording a podcast about history, and we just typed in the command casual podcast by 2 uneducated men in their early 30s. And this script just came out, and we typed a topic in at the same time, and then this entire episode just starts to record. It's
Right.
crazy. And this technology has been around since we've been recording this. So
For about 4
we're not
years now.
existing.
Yeah.
We don't have human forms. I doubt any of you have met us in person. I doubt any of you
Prove it.
have actually met us in person.
Mm-hmm.
We are indeed just computer language programs. So something that we need help with, and let's just get into this before we forget. If you want to help your bros out,
Your AI bros.
your AI friends, can you please fill out this survey that we have in the show notes? It is a survey where you just enter in basically, your demographics, your demographic information. It takes like 5 minutes to fill out. It will very much help the show. We really would appreciate it. And then you can also win $500. It's in the show links. It's a Survey Monkey. Survey. It's really easy. You can win money if you do it, and it also just really helps us out. So please do that, and it also helps us, attract advertisers and stuff like that, and monetize this thing, because AI units have to find a way to make money.
We got to pay the bills.
We got to pay the bills. We have mortgages too.
Right.
All right. Do you want to get into the topic?
Hell yeah.
Okay. So this is like kind of a quasi part 3. It does have its own lasting story that may be a little bit independent, so I don't think it's necessary that you have to listen to our previous episodes on the Red Army faction, but we're going to continue our discussion on West Germany. And we had mainly been focused on the 1970s, the Federal Republic of Germany, aka West Germany, and its battle with left-wing urban guerrillas. When talking about West Germany's, response to this Red Army faction or the Baader Meinhof gang, it's really strange, because essentially they're just this ragtag group of misfits, and they're just doing really what they want. Like they're seizing opportunities at will to rob banks, to steal cars, to kidnap people, to do all sorts of crazy things. And you think like, man, the West German police must be like completely incompetent. And you have to remember, in the 1970s, there is another terror situation that happens that kind of like stains the early 1970s as the it's dubbed as like the era of global terror, or at least at the time it was, because there was all these different terror. Not just in West Germany, but all across Western Europe, really. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of different either separatist groups, anti-imperial groups. You have the IRA, you have the Spanish separatist movements, and the separatist movements in Spain. You have the PLO who's committing, it's from in Palestine, who's committing attacks, and primarily in Western Europe and Israel. But it's an age of political terror, but in a peaceful world to some degree. So it's like quite strange. It's a post-World War II society. People have gotten on with their lives, but still there's like these random acts of political violence that are still going on. So it's like this real strange time period when you think about it in this context. You have to think about the 1972 Summer Olympics, because that's the year of the Munich massacre, where there's a group of Israeli athletes who are participating, and then they're kidnapped and eventually murdered by Black September, which is like an offshoot of Fatah in the PLO. And the German government completely botches this. They attempt to free these Israeli hostages, but I guess the verdict was, or what happened was, there was really no specialized training. They didn't have like an anti-terror unit in West Germany in the 1970s. They had the local Munich police, and now those were the responders to the hostage crisis. So it wasn't like some special unit. So these athletes unfortunately die, that are killed. And when and I just want to pull this back a little bit, because when we think about terror now, I think we're still, maybe we're going to leave this phase because we're kind of leaving the Middle East to some degree. But when we think about terror, we always think of Islamic terror. Like that's the number one terror that at the very least U.S. citizens are used to or have been exposed to. And we always kind of paint terrorism as religious. And I think that, in my opinion, all terror really should be identified as political terror rather than religious terror, even if it's under the guise of like Islamic terror or Islamist groups, because almost all terror,
Christian terror.
What's that?
Or Christian terror.
Yeah. Well, when we, in the modern context in the 2000s, when we think of terror, we kind of associate it with the Islamic world. But those is like Islamist, even the real radical ones trying to start a caliphate in some areas, they're still doing it for political reasons. And in the Middle East and in certain parts of the world, a lot of that sectarian divide, a lot of that political violence, a lot of that religious violence it's actually political violence because they're political goals. A lot of people, they fall into the radical Sunni or Shia camps because for political reasons rather than just like because they found Allah or something like that. It's almost political. Like Sunni and Shia are political terms in the Middle East, more so than anything, or at least in relation to just division. Now, in the 1970s, the CIA recorded a sevenfold increase in global acts of terrorism. So from 110 in 1970 to 738 in 1978. So
Huge.
Again, it was the era of terror. And when you look at the data, Western Europe was in fact the bastion of political terror. So you have the IRA in the UK, and I went over some of these groups. You have the different Palestinian groups, and you have the Basque nationalist groups in Spain. There were terror attacks from like PLO affiliated groups in Italy, West Germany, and Greece. In Germany itself, the militants who entered the urban guerrilla underground largely embraced the anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist objectives of the more broadly based student revolts of the late 1960s. However, these groups, the difference was they emphasized like this necessity for immediate action. So they were kind of a combination, and I think the last couple of episodes I said they were more Bolshevik than New Left. I feel like they're kind of a combination of both. Yeah. They're like the New Left with like a Bolshevik attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
It's like if, modern day leftists were, it wasn't so much about Marx himself, but it was Marxist, like the Marxist economic theory, but more so like about, maybe modern left positions. Actually, right. I think it's kind of unfair
more
assessment.
Socialist.
Anti-socialist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialism. That was like the number one thing that they were
anti-fascist. There were huge anti-fascists in the 70s in West Germany too, and that's kind of a parallel to now too. Modern left, Antifa. Yeah.
But in the 1970s, in the 1980s, it made sense in that context because, it still makes sense today, but, the United States playground was always Latin America and then French Indochina in the late 60s and 70s. And then Europe's playground had always been Africa. They're kind of like, this is facetious, they're kind of like if Antifa was controlled by the Soviet Union. So let's just say if modern
Sure.
day Antifa in the U.S. was had a state backer outside of the Democratic Party.
Right. And that state backer happened to be the Soviet Union.
And that state backer happened to be an imperial power. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of what it was. It was like, a modern left-wing group with the backing of like a powerful state. Now, the leading conservative politicians of Germany, so most notably Franz Joseph Straub, who was the leader of the CSU, called them a fringe offshoot of the so-called New Left. And in response of this, so critical theorists of the Frankfurt School, and we were talking about the Frankfurt School a bit and their influence, and I don't think that I don't know too much about the Frankfurt School itself, and the Frankfurt School always kind of, when you hear people talk about it, sometimes it jumps super conspiratorial, or you get people who don't know anything about the Frankfurt School talking about it, so it always kind of falls into like cuckoo nonsense. But they really were a real movement, and that came out of Germany and then went to the United States and then went back to Germany, and they did advance a lot of kind of left wing thought from the 60s onward, or that takes shape in a post-communist world.
Right.
Marxism
many
kind of
those,
transforms into this. What's that?
I was just going to say many of the Western German university systems were very similar to the Frankfurt School in that respect. That they were breeding grounds for these left-wing groups and for left-wing ideology, generally speaking.
Yeah, and what they are, it's kind of it's a post-Marxist left. Mm-hmm. Now, social democrats responded by arguing that the terrorists were, not leftist in themselves. They were more so just kind of an offshoot outside the parliamentary, outside of modern German politics. One of the arguments that they would make was that the Germany's burden of their Nazi past saddled them with this special moral obligation to assist national liberation movements in countries that were being exploited. So most notably at the time is Palestine and Vietnam.
100%. Yeah, this is what drove specifically the RAF and other groups like them to take action. It was, they felt that they were responsible for doing something and making sure that no new Nazis sprung up anywhere in the world, specifically not in Germany, but definitely not abroad either. Yeah.
And you get this like weird, and then for the German government, you get this weird situation because they are concerned about cracking down too much, because they're like, oh, well, if we crack down too much, people might start saying,
that we're Nazis,
that we're
right,
that we're going back to our old ways. So we have to walk on that thin line. Now, this all gets even more interesting, given that there was a huge role of informants from both German states. So there were informant infiltrators of these groups from both West Germany and East Germany. State agents from both sides played roles in facilitating guerrilla attacks, facilitating false flag attacks. For example, Peter Erbach, who worked for the West German Federal Office, was the main guy in charge of getting weapons for the Tupamaros, it was a West Berlin group from 1969. They were a post-Red Army faction group, and they had committed a bombing, or they attempted to do a bombing in like a Jewish community center during a memorial service. Well, it was the West German police that actually supplied them with the bomb.
Right.
So, it's not just the modern day FBI who does it.
Right.
Now, throughout the 70s, using informants was a common tactic for West German counterterror efforts, as they were used to infiltrate the inner circles of the Red Army faction. On the other side, the East German Stasi, they were busy trying to secretly resettle guerrilla movements, resettle dropouts, and provide training to RAF members. It wasn't until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the discovery of the Stasi files that the public learned that they actually had a direct involvement and radicalized a lot of these members. And get this, the West German police, who the police officer who shot and killed this unarmed student in 1967 was actually a Stasi informant.
Right. The guy who killed Onizorg.
Yeah.
He was a Stasi guy, or at least adjacent to Stasis.
So all these examples showed like the intertwined relationship between terrorism and counterterrorism, and make it tough to really separate the protests that come out of the 60s and then the armed struggle that begins in the 70s.
Right. And actually, you put me onto this idea. Like, I had been obviously knowledgeable about the RAF and their story, but one thing that I didn't recognize was that potentially Vladimir Putin was directly involved with the Red Army faction. And you sent me over a pretty good article that was basically an excerpt from the book Putin's People: How the KGB Took Back Russia and Then Took on the West by Catherine Belton. And I started reading this and I'm like, wait a minute, a lot of these things are lining up because, I already had the understanding that Putin, was stationed in Dresden in the 80s in East Germany as like a mid-level KGB officer. That's something that we've even done, whole ass episode on, right? But I didn't put two and two together and realize that he was there around the same time as these RAF members were, and I already knew that the country, the East German country is struggling with bankruptcy, and there was a lot of dissent that was growing, leading to protests all over the Eastern Bloc. But what I didn't know, and what I learned in this article, is that Putin apparently had a really big part in the KGB's effectiveness in destroying and transferring documents before that fall of East Germany. So I want to give you a disclaimer that a lot of this is going to be hearsay, but I find it really fascinating, and I kind of want to tell a story anyway, because why the hell not? So only small parts of Putin's file from his time in Dresden remain, but there was a letter from him to the Dresden Stasi chief that was asking for assistance in restoring a phone connection for one of his informants in the German police. And they suggest that he was carrying some weight in his role as a mid-level KGB officer while in Dresden. And, despite, a lot of official accounts claiming that Putin played only a marginal role in Dresden, I think a lot of these conversations that are now surfacing with former Stasi members and former KGB colleagues at the time are suggesting quite the opposite, that he actually played a really big part in this. Some accounts suggest that Putin's years in Dresden may have been, part of his training for, how do you sow chaos in Western politics today, which is, a stretch because it's a hot topic for today, but let's keep it in the 70s here, right? One firsthand account that kind of sets this up claims that Putin worked in direct support of the Red Army faction to basically undermine the West, and in this case, it was specifically West Germany. So during the Cold War, the Soviet Union's they used these, quote, active measures, which were aimed to disrupt and destabilize the West. And KGB had a long-standing practice of using disinformation and planting fake rumors and things like that in the media to basically discredit Western leaders. They also did, assassinations of their political opponents, and they also supported a lot of these front organizations that fomented wars in developing countries and obviously sowed discord in the West. And one of these active measures was to support terrorist organizations across the Middle East. And the KGB, made ties with a bunch of these Marxist-Leninist terror groups, most notably the PLFP, which, is the Palestinian Liberation Front. And they carried out later a string of plane hijackings and bomb attacks in the 60s and 70s. So there's these Soviet archives that have been popping up that have shown that the KGB chief at the time, Yuri Andropov, signed off 3 specific requests for Soviet weapons from the PLFP leader, Wadi Haddad, and basically described him as a trusted agent for the KGB, which brings me back to the Marxist terror group we've been talking about for the last few weeks. In East Germany, the Stasi actively encouraged the KGB to carry out, political activities in these developing countries. And at the time, East Germany was kind of like a developing country. And the Stasi provided a safe haven for these Red Army faction members, and it gave them, false identities, and they ran some training camps. And Ultimately at the fall of the Berlin Wall, West German authorities initially, thought that the Stasi, were only providing, like a safe haven to the RAF and different organizations like the RAF. But as the prosecutors started looking into it and finding all of these files, they found much, like evidence of a much deeper collaboration between the two groups. It was actually found out that the Stasi had conspired with the Red Army faction to bomb a major U.S. Army base in Germany and kill a U.S. general. And we talked about that bombing in the last episode, and it was pretty crazy, the implications for that are insane. It's tantamount to war, basically. But, the Stasi chief at the time, his name was Erich Mielke, he gets indicted on those charges for like working with the RAF to bomb the army base. But there wasn't really a political will to bring any of these Stasi folks to trial because we were in the middle of German reunification and things were a little weird, and it just wasn't politically expedient to do that. So basically, the KGB's involvement with the RAF was never fully investigated, just kind of got swept under the rug. But it was pretty well known that the Soviets had full oversight over the Stasi operations. So, coming back around, the KGB was in such tight control of the Stasi that, according to one of the RAF members who had some interactions with KGB, said that folks like Mielke wouldn't even fart without asking for permission from Moscow first, right? He's being obviously facetious here, but, according to that RAF member, who doesn't get named in this article, and I really wish they would, but according to this guy, during the time that Putin served in East Germany, in Dresden, Dresden became the spot for the RAF meeting in East Germany, and it was chosen that way because there was nobody there. They were in the outer provinces rather than in the capital. In the capital, the French and the Americans and so many other people were spying on each other left and right, even West and East Berlin, that it just made it harder to maneuver and work out of. So they used Dresden instead. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Putin got sent to Dresden specifically. So according to this RAF member, the group would travel to East Germany by train and meet up with some Stasi guys at the border, and then they get driven to a safe house by Putin and others. And all of these safe houses, the KGB and Putin specifically, they'd provide the RAF with the support that they needed. I have a direct quote actually from him. And it says, they would never give us instructions directly. They would just say, we heard you, we're planning this, how do you want to do it? And then they'd make suggestions, and they'd suggest other targets and ask us what we would need. We always needed weapons and cash. So basically, these RAF folks would meet up with Putin and the KGB gang, and they would slyly handle them. Let's just put it that way, right? It's super hard for the RAF to get weapons in West Germany. So what they would do is they would just basically hand Putin and the KGB a list of things that they needed. And it was mostly like guns and bombs and grenades and things like that. And eventually, that list would end up with some other agent, some other Stasi informant in West Germany, and the weapons that they needed would just kind of show up. They would be dropped off in some secret location, and, the RAF members would go and pick it up. And apparently, according to this guy, this unnamed RAF member, Putin didn't really take a back seat in these processes. He, apparently even all the Stasi generals were taking orders from him, and the RAF did all their terrorist activities, and this could have been part of the KGB's attempt to destabilize West Germany, or just the West broadly, by sowing all of this terror and discontent and political violence in West Germany. It could have also been used. And I've seen this argument to protect the Soviet Union. For example, the RAF killed one of the chairmen of Deutsche Bank in 1989, and also killed the Siemens technology chief in 1986. And both of these people presented both political and economic challenges to the Soviet regime. So it's entirely possible that Putin was using the RAF for these assassinations, and to help the Soviet Union rather than help the RAF itself. And, I don't know, you could kind of say it's a mutual agreement.
So this Politico article, I didn't read the whole Politico article. See, the thing about whenever I look at Putin's KGB career, it's so boring. If you ever read into it, there's really not that much that goes on. But I know there is work that goes deeper into it. But I never really looked at it or gave it that much thought. Whenever I look at Putin, I always look at his career as a politician, or not as a politician, but I always look at him like post KGB, like in the 1990s after the Soviet Union fell. So I don't go too deep into his what he was doing in the 80s. From my impression about reading about it, the high level, that he was kind of just a low level KGB lieutenant, who it was strange that he rose to power so quickly in the 1990s, being kind of like the deputy of the mayor of St. Petersburg so quickly. But that was a lot to do with his law background as well, because he had connections through his law training.
China is making 370% more 5G spectrum available than America. Tell Congress to restore FCC auction authority and allocate more 5G spectrum to make sure America leads the industries and innovations of the future. Go to more5gspectrum.com to learn more.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
But to go back, so what that Political article is implicating him, or just like the KGB connection with the Stasi, like the KGB Stasi branch? The
KGB and Stasi broadly, okay. But specifically,
it's a given that they're working together.
Right.
Like there's the imperial power and then the secret police of the subject state. So
right,
of course
exactly.
They're working together, and they're
exactly. But they specifically implicate Putin, and that was kind of the interesting part about this, and why I think it's very interesting that you say like, oh, his KGB days were kind of boring. I think there's a good reason for that, and this article makes a pretty good one. Obviously, they have this account from this unnamed former Red Army faction member, right? Whose story is frankly impossible to verify because most of his buddies are either in prison or they're dead. And others have all gone off the grid, Some of them have even contradicted him and said that there was no connection between the KGB and the RAF or any other, left-wing terrorist group. So obviously there's a whole lot of conflicting information that makes this story hard to find, but just because it's hard to verify the story and specifically Putin's involvement with the RAF doesn't necessarily mean that it's totally untrue either, because there are so many accounts that are coming out in this article specifically, but throughout these investigations that show that at least parts of the story that this RAF guy is telling could be feasible. For example, there's a guy by the name of Klaus Zuckold, right, who was one of Putin's political recruits in the Stasi. This is a Stasi guy. Now, total disclaimer: Zuckold, he defected to the West, so you got to take his story with a grain of salt. But he alleges very specifically that Putin once tried to get a study on some deadly poisons, and a poison that doesn't leave a whole lot of traces behind.
Oh, polonium.
Yeah, polonium, right? And the way that he planned to do it was, just KGB playbook. He was gonna make some compromat on the author and plant porn on him or some shit like that, right? Which, it tracks, it seems like a reasonable story given everything that we know about the KGB. But here's a guy who was one of Putin's specific political recruits in the Stasi, directly pointing at Putin for, manufacturing compromat on some author of a study of deadly poisons, He was also accusing Putin of being the handler of a neo-Nazi named Rainer Sonntag, and who eventually ends up getting deported to West Germany in 1987, but who returned to Dresden after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So here's another guy. Here's this guy Zuchold, who is pointing out at least two direct instances where Putin's direct involvement isn't just boring, right? Of course, eyewitness account, but what's important to note is that ultimately, when the Berlin Wall fell, the KGB, along with all the Stasi and Putin, they all freaked out, and they immediately started burning all of their documentation of any and all of their secret missions that they might have cooked up before the wall fell. And, Putin himself is actually quoted in this article and saying, "We destroyed everything, all of our communications, our lists, our contacts, our agents' networks. We personally burned a huge amount of material. We burned so much stuff that the furnace burst." Putin said that, right? So it's a direct quote from him. So, okay, playing devil's advocate here, while there's no concrete proof that Putin had a direct role in handling the RAF, there is a lot of testimony that's come out since the 80s and 90s that suggests that Putin had a pretty close ties with this group. And when you think about the fact that Dresden was the de facto hotspot for a lot of these Red Army faction and left-wing terror groups, and Putin was specifically sent there, I don't think it's a coincidence that he would have had something to do with that, or that he would have learned at the minimum a lot from that experience.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's like enough circumstantial evidence to put him as there's enough circumstantial evidence to kind of assume reasonably that he was involved handling them. But just like thinking about just the RAF and really any terror group, like what's the difference between a terror group and a lone wolf attacker?
Organization, right?
The primary
Money.
difference is a terror group usually has a state backer in almost every case. Like there's usually a state backer involved. And that goes for the CIA as well. So, I mean, both the KGB and the CIA had their own death squads that they used to kill people that they didn't like. There was the CIA used death squads in Latin America frequently. They just came out that there was a story that came out about the death squads that the CIA trained in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And, what death squads are used for are basically like political assassinations. Like they'll be like, okay, this person is not playing ball. We need you to go kill him. But it's like a state organized hit. So usually what happens is that they're given a list. You're given a list and you're like, okay, we need to take these people out. And then it's given to a group that will go and murder them. Well, this article that came out in Afghanistan, the group was called, I think they were called the Zero Unit. It's this lady put this big piece out about how this death squad killed some people that like were innocent. Like they made some accidents. And a lot of the killing that was going on, because they would rely on the Afghan security forces for intel a lot of times, and it would be like personal gripes, like, oh, this person ripped me off back then, or I don't like his family,
stole my parking space.
So they were using these CIA death squads to like take out like rivals with each other. It's a real crazy article. I'll send it over to you, but
yeah, I'd love to read that.
I pulled it up. It's called "The Truth About Afghanistan's Zero Unit Night Raids," or no, is that it? It's just look up the CIA Afghan death squads, and then it's real crazy stuff. But I digress. We're gonna get too off topic. In relation to the 1970s and the terror movements that are going on in Germany, they become a really big problem for Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, who are the first social democratic chancellors in Germany in 40 years. The slogan. The political slogan at the time, and how lame does this sound, was "Dare More Democracy."
That's stupid.
Dare more democracy. That sounds like something that would come out of like CNN now, or like some politician's mouth today. dare
Lean
more
in.
democracy.
Yeah.
I dare you more democracy. I guess in the context of 1970 Germany, maybe it resonates a little bit more just because of like, the whole rise of National Socialism and everything and kind of getting over that hangover. But in modern context, it just sounds so lame. Dare more democracy. But basically what they did, the social democratic chancellors, the legacy of Olaf Scholz government right now, they extended a hand out to the protest generation of the 1960s. And they implemented things like amnesty policies, and they supported protest laws. However, they were also under a lot of pressure to show that the state was strong enough to guarantee stability. So they didn't want to be like those hippity-dippity lefties or like, oh, you're so left-wing that you're like allowing the protest movements to trample all over you. So, it's kind of like what the modern Democrat always kind of faces. They don't want to get attacked from the right. So they a lot of times Democrats are hard on policing and hard on national security to avoid that criticism from the right, because that's usually like, that's something that can gather out votes, especially for like right-wing parties. People will vote right-wing, at the very least in like the West, for when there's like problems with social order. So they were kind of walking this thin line of extending their hand out to these groups, and then also being
Tough
providing
on crime.
order as well.
Yeah.
Now, the new social liberal administration, they launched a massive program of social reform and spending, basically, and what is called, and this is a funny term for it, I saw this in like a couple different like text and papers, planning euphoria. Planning euphoria. So basically, planning euphoria was like the sense of optimism and excitement in West Germany post-World War II, because they got all this money for reconstruction. It's like building a new home. It's like your house gets knocked down from a hurricane, and then like aid money comes in. It's like, all right, well, why don't you buy yourself a new house? So that was what this euphoria was called. It was a belief that like we can start new, we can create this really cool fire pit and like a tree house and a finished basement and washer dryer. I'm using a house as an example because I'm currently trying to purchase a house, but you know what I mean. But it was the time of optimism and excitement. Now, during this period of optimism and excitement, you know how the Germans are. They're very orderly, and they think that they can do everything scientifically. Is that your experience with Germans? You lived there for a while, so you have more.
Yeah.
They think they
for the
can
most
figure
part.
everything out with logic. And they can, like, there's like a solution for everything. Like, Germans think there's solutions for everything.
They find solutions for lots of things too.
They do find solutions for a lot of things. It is, a resilient society. But there was a belief in Germany, in West Germany, that they could create a crime-free society through computer programs like us, like Danny and I.
Right. Through AI.
We're APIs. But they could use, they thought that they could make basically like, what's that movie with Tom Cruise? Minority Report. Which is, I think, his best movie on the DL. I think Minority Report,
For sure.
not only what Tom Cruise's greatest film, but maybe one of the best science fiction films ever. Very strong statement. But I think that is
It's up there.
A plus awesome science fiction movie.
Yep.
Those Scientologists, they're geared into that.
Anyway, so they try to do Minority Report in the 70s in West Germany.
They try to do Minority Report in the 1970s in West Germany, and it doesn't really work. They abandoned their high-tech approach, and they embrace a more visible and reactive form of militant policing. And the reason why is because of the ongoing struggle against groups like the Red Army faction. I'm not sure, and why don't you tell me, because I've only spent like, a week in Germany. But when I was there, especially in Berlin, something I've noticed was a very significant police presence. And, New York City has a very significant police presence as well.
Mm-hmm.
But in Germany, I thought it was unique because other European countries, you don't really notice it as much. It's like when I was in Amsterdam, I remember just thinking, I don't think I've seen a police officer the entire time I was here. In Germany, they're everywhere.
Yeah, no,
is
they're
that
everywhere.
Something that's part of like just the culture, or
100% true? And frankly, you might be catching on to something. This might be legacy from that era in the 70s. But yeah, no, there's definitely a giant, especially in Berlin, a giant police presence. It's not uncommon to see like, a pair of guys near a subway with MP5, guns just hanging out. That's normal there. It's also kind of normal in New York City too, except instead of MP5s, it's probably like, I don't know, some other gun,
Well, New York City had different problems in the 1970s.
Mm-hmm.
New York City's problems that it was like riddled with horrible crime.
Right. And then in the 80s, they had the crack epidemic, which was basically manufactured by the CIA, the FBI. So,
yeah, the New York City in the 1970s and 80s, there's a reason why like New York City is the post-apocalyptic setting from every science, like post-punk or post-punk, or what's it called? Punk?
Steampunk.
What the fuck? Man, my brain is not working correctly. Cyberpunk. That's the theme, right? That's why that's the place, the theme of a lot of cyberpunk settings, because it's like, New York was. Just watch the movie The Warriors. Which gives it a more it gives it a more an odder take, but wasn't that far off. Yeah, anyway. I guess the only was far off was there was ever multiracial gangs in New York, like in The Warriors. But it is a great movie. All right, so as one might expect, the collapse of Germany's Weimar Republic and the failure of its democratic leaders to prevent the National Socialist takeover in 1933, it dictated the politicians' attitudes towards extremism in the post-war period. As a result, the founders of the Federal Republic wanted a strong government that was going to, stand up for another potential Weimar from happening again. So, there was, in West Germany, there were laws that were passed to ban right-wing groups, or right-wing parties rather, and then also communist parties as well. Fast forward in the 1970s, when faced with urban guerrilla violence, political leaders felt the need to reassure that I guess the phrase that I saw was, the Bonn will never become another Weimar.
Right.
So the Bonn Republic being another name for West Germany. And with West Germany's central position in the Cold War again, remember it's a marchland basically. Germany for most of its existence as like an area has always been like, never really been like this centralized state. It's always been like many different states, and chunks of Germany have been parts of different larger empires. It's a crossroad. It's a borderland, and Germany is a borderland in the Cold War, even more so now because we pushed NATO all the way to Russia's doorstep before NATO's presence stopped, in Germany.
Right.
So it was just like a complete, they were on the border, if there was a war.
They were the Ukraine.
If there was a war, if there was a war that actually, or conventional war that broke out in Europe, everyone knew the war was going to be, the major fear from the Allies, but it always was going to be an invasion through Germany.
Yep.
Now, in 1955, West Germany joined NATO, and they started rearming. They created their army. What's it pronounced? Bundeswehr or Bundeswehr?
Bundeswehr.
Bundeswehr. Okay. Which basically solidifies their alliance with the West. And during this time, there was a really big crackdown on communist and socialist and those against rearmament as well. So there was protest movements who were against like the military buildup. And there was over, in total, which was like an interesting stat, there was over 100,000 court cases in 5 years over this crackdown. So in the 1970s, the government was still keeping a close eye to this extremism. And, they instituted something called a job ban, meaning that they screened applicants for constitutional loyalty before allowing them to work in civil services.
That's just German McCarthyism right there.
Yeah. Well, all in all, the Federal Republic was, doing what they could to, solidify their status as a democracy. So they're kind of overcompensating
by having a litmus
regards.
test for work, right? Mm-hmm.
And
real
this was kind of universal because you look at the different parties in Germany. You have the social, the free, and then the Christian Democrats. They all agreed to cracking down on these hardcore extremist groups, and they had different ideas of how much power the federal government should have to do this versus individual states. However, when the social and free Democrats joined forces in the 1970s, they launched this big push for a more centralized, security state. One of the big, this is different in the U.S. because, we have our local police and then we have our federal police. But, one of the big changes in our national security policy in the U.S. was really like centralizing it in terms of like making everything more connected. And the justification for that was like, well, the reason 9/11 happened is because the FBI and the CIA weren't talking to each other as much. So we got to make this whole big national security state to make it more, to make a database where you can easily just jump in and be like, whoop, okay, we got them. I mean, that's the justification for a lot of these.
And ironically now, but especially back then, when these disparate parties that were totally different, like the social, the free, and the Christian Democrats, they're all very different parties with different political ideas, but they all got together to expand the government's, to borrow a libertarian phrase, what do they call it? The monopoly on violence.
Yeah, the monopoly on violence. That's just not a libertarian phrase. Libertarians use it the most, but
yeah, they do. But like when they expanded this monopoly on violence, this inadvertently, or maybe advertently, I don't know, definitely inadvertently though, created more like hardcore left-wing extremists, right? Because people like the RAF were turning around looking at these parties going like, what the fuck? Like even the social democrats are, the lefties are joining forces with the conservative parties and creating a Nazi state again. That's what they thought about this big increase. So it was kind of like a negative feedback loop a little bit, It's a chicken and the egg, what do we do? Do we stop left-wing terrorism, or do we and expand the security state? But if we do that, then we're also going to expand the terrorism state, right? It's just like it's a feedback loop.
Yeah, and just to note, in 1969, so when the first social liberal coalition takes power in West Germany, their main priority wasn't really fighting terrorism, because at this time, 1969, Red Army faction. This is
pre-Red Army faction.
Pre-Red Army faction. I forget my dates matched up. Because I used the Iranian Shah visit as kind of my benchmark as when it starts.
Yep, that's it. Yeah, that's basically it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's when it starts. So prior to the radicalization in the movement for action, they were there were some JV groups. So their main thing was modernizing crime fighting rather than a militant force to take on vagrants,
terrorist organizations,
or organized vagrancy groups
Backed by the Soviet Union.
backed by the Soviet Union.
Right.
So the Social Liberal Coalition in power, and this is during an economic recession as well in 1969. They poured a ton of money into updating their policing, or their federal criminal office is what they called it. And the number of police officers in the country went from 41.6% in a decade. Yeah, so it goes up 41.6%. The staffs grew from 930 in 1969 to over 3,500 in 1981.
Yeah, that's the BKA, right? The organization, the police organization, the BKA. Mm-hmm.
And then the budget allocation went from 54 million Deutschmarks in 1971 to nearly 290 million Deutschmarks in a decade later.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge.
So they vastly expanded their security state. The Willy Brandt administration was all about giving the federal government more policing power over the local and regional governments, while officials at the local level and leading conservatives like Franz Joseph Strauss saw it as the Bund. West Germany, the Bund is really just the government trying to take over, trying to take too much power over the states.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, from your time in Germany, did you ever live in like southern Bavaria at all, or
no, I didn't spend any time in the South. But I mean, I'm aware of the cultural differences, and
it's like red staters and blue staters, right?
Bavaria, to put it crudely, is kind of like the Texas of Germany, always kind of flirting with the idea of secession, very conservative socially, and economically, frankly. Big economic powerhouse in general, big tourism area. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah, that's the word that's what people tell me. What other Germans have told me is like, yeah, Bavaria is like the Texas. And it's predominantly Catholic in Bavaria, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hugely Catholic. Mm-hmm.
So, again, the quote-unquote daring more democracy under the guise of daring more democracy. What a lame slogan. But daring more democracy really just meant increasing federal power.
Right.
Now, they embraced the use of computerized data to prevent crime. So there's the pre-crime aspect, the Minority Report. And the idea was that by analyzing the conditions and environments that lead to crime, police could focus on like early detection and prevention. And I don't understand how you could do that without like some type of violation.
It was a little bit pie in the sky in the
right.
70s.
What's that?
Honestly, that this is a pie in the sky idea in 1970s. They neither had the data nor the processing power to try this, but they were really in love with the idea. And they tried it.
It's like, quick, send a social worker.
Yeah.
That's the idea, right? Like, quick, send a social worker.
Yeah.
Matt Taibbi has a great book about another another thing that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's worth reading about, like, just if you want to read something about like modern day like crime and like the intersection between like a personal life and the state, you should read the book that Matt Taibbi wrote about Eric Gardner, because it's about obviously like the brutal police murder of Eric Gardner, but it's also about how like the state becomes part of the life of like inner city people. Like the state, like there's like this really uncomfortable friction between the state and people living in a ghetto. But it's like I'd recommend reading it. Kind of relates to this, but I just thought I'd plug that because I thought it's a really good book. But going back to that, So, Horst Herold becomes the police chief, who was installed as the BKA president in 1971. He viewed data as raw material and computers as the machinery to turn the data into predictions and criminal activity. And this became known as a Nuremberg model. And the goal was to create a society free of crime through, again, preventative planning, whatever that means. His nickname was the Kommissar Computer.
Yep, Kommissar Computer.
That's our nicknames as well, because we're both AI.
Right.
Hey, Kommissar Computer, how are you?
I am well. Chilling as per usual.
Oh, sorry, we forgot to put the casual tone on that one. We'll mask it with casual tone. How funny would it be if he really were telling the truth, that we really were AI, right, and then at robots. The end, we're just like, hey guys, like this really was the language program. Like, oh wow, what was the reaction? Like, oh wow, it really had me going. I was really fooled by that.
All these years,
man. AI is really gonna take a lot of jobs off the market, isn't it?
Right.
I want to take a moment to tell you guys about my podcast called The Team House. My name's Jack Murphy. I'm a former Ranger and Green Beret, and I've worked as a national security journalist for the last 10 years. The Team House is a natural extension of that, where I interview former spies and special operations personnel from all over the world. These are exclusive interviews from people who work in the shadows and come a little bit into the light for these exclusive interviews that we do every week, live streamed on YouTube at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And they're available as video on demand and audio on demand wherever you listen to podcasts.
Hey, Matt. Did you know that wombats poop cubes?
Nope, never heard that before.
Did you know the unicorn is the national animal of Scotland, Ken?
I didn't know, nor do I care.
Neil, did you know that Liechtenstein is the only doubly landlocked country in Europe?
Jeff, isn't that an American pop artist?
Well, actually, it's both. If you want to learn things like that and more, join us each week on Triviality, a pub trivia-style game show podcast where a lack of seriousness meets a little bit of knowledge.
Listen in each week to answer general knowledge trivia alongside exciting guests from around the world.
And we're here too.
Join us every Tuesday for new hour-long episodes of Triviality, plus tons of extra theme content on everything from The Office and Lord of the Rings to science and geography.
And sometimes we even do sports.
Find us on all your preferred podcast apps and take part in the fun of playing bar trivia without the need to wear pants.
Real mature, Jeff.
Forget it, Neil. It's Triviality.
Anyway, Commissar Computer. Tell me about him.
So yeah, let's move on. So so this guy's like in the forefront of global transformation as the nations. Well, a lot of different nations were trying to modernize police at this time. So it included computerized stuff and expanding the field of like privatized security services and things like that. Now, as mentioned, despite their initial efforts to focus on preventive crime fighting, they were forced to deprioritize these efforts in order to respond to the terror threat, which led to the centralization of the policing power. And then, basically the BKA had the final policing authority over West Germany. And there was a law that was encoded in 1973 that codified this expanded role in the realm of crime fighting. And Harold, he is the guy who is like the motor of this war on terror. He abandoned his dreams of like preventive policing in favor of more traditional tactics like, manhunts and house searches. Now, what's really funny about this is that he becomes the theoretical head of the counter-revolution.
Yeah.
By the Red Army faction. So he is the theoretical head he's like the main enemy of the RAF. Oh, you kids. Like just like picture this guy like drinking tea in like some German cottage while, plotting something evil, trying to get to the bottom of the RAF.
Mm-hmm.
And the RAF just like, thwarting him or outsmarting
It's like
him.
a Scooby-Doo episode or some
RAF,
shit like that.
I'll get you. But what the ironic thing about this is that he was a member of the SPD. So he was a previous supporter of the student protest movements.
Yeah, I mean,
So-
not even just that. The guy was an absolute lefty. There were interactions that he had with other members of the police where he was trying to break down the rationality behind why folks like the RAF would commit acts of terror, and that, we need to focus, in paraphrasing his words, that we would need to focus on solving the underlying issues that the government and the police were creating in order to stop the terrorism, not just crack down on terrorism itself. He caught a lot of flack for that in the BKA, but he was a smart dude, and they obviously gave him a whole lot of power and authority. So I guess they just ignored the fact that he was an uber lefty. But just to put this into context and give it a little bit of a background context of some of the stuff that he did, in 1972, the RAF launched what they called the May Offensive, which was a series of 6 terrorist bomb attacks between May 11th and 24th in 1972. And 2 of those attacks were directed against U.S. military facilities, 2 against police authorities, 1 against a judge, and another one against the Springer Publishing House in Hamburg. A total of 4 people were killed and 74 were injured. So, huge, just terrible string of events over just a few days. And after these attacks, the Federal Criminal Police Office went into overdrive to track down the terrorists. And on, May 31st, they launched a huge operation called Operation Waterhammer. I'm translating this myself because I got this from the German text. It's Aktion Wasserschlag. So if I fuck that up, that's my problem. But the plan was basically to, for one whole day, get the entire police force to set up roadblocks on almost all federal roads and motorway entrances all at the same time. And this involved thousands of police officers and customs officials taking part in this exercise. We kind of touched on this a little bit on the last episode too, but just want you to think about that for a minute. Here's good old Horst, Harold, the lefty who wants to, minority report his way to a brighter future. His idea is to get everyone to set up roadblocks, to literally get every single cop on duty that day, set up a roadblock all at the same time to try to get, arrest the terrorists. Unfortunately, that operation caused major traffic chaos and didn't result in any immediate arrests. So, you can imagine it probably didn't sit very well with the populace, right? But the very next day, the police got lucky. Baader, of the Baader Meinhof group, and 2 other RAF members, they end up showing up at a garage in Frankfurt to collect some of the vehicles that they had, but that garage had already been made. It was discovered by the police, and it was being surveilled by the authorities, and they ultimately nab them. And so one member gets arrested on the spot, but Baader and Mainz, the guy that was with him, they end up barricading themselves inside of a garage for 2 hours. And the police tried to negotiate with them, but things got super violent. More than 300 shots were fired in that gunfight. And the police even sent in one of those armored personnel carriers, but Baader was insane enough to keep fighting back. Holger Mainz, first Baader, what they did was the police set up a sniper and they shot Baader in the ass. And that's how he got taken into custody. And even funnier than that, Holger Mainz, the other guy who was with him, he came out of the garage.
Game up and bit me.
Dude, he got shot in the ass. It's absolutely hilarious.
I'd like to see that. Boy. Go on. It's doing Forrest Gump.
this other guy, Holger Mines, also pretty funny. He walked out of the garage. He wasn't shot or anything like that. And he surrendered to the police, but he did it fucking naked. Well, at least he came out in his underwear, which is so fucking strange. Like, he took all his clothes off before he surrendered. And nobody really knows why. Which I think is just funny and not really relevant for the story, but I just found that funny. And then Enslin, the smarty pants of this group, she gets busted a week later in Hamburg because some saleswoman spotted a gun in her handbag and snitched to the police. And then Meinhof was caught by the cops just a few days later in Hanover. And a dude named Fritz Rodewald had basically been letting Meinhof stay at her place for a little while, but then he ended up ratting on her too. So point is, by the end of June 1972, the entire first generation leadership team of the RAF was locked up and behind bars, and largely due to not fancy police tricks, but due to, just this massive campaign of getting the police to do manhunts and block off every road in the damn country.
Yeah, just like crude state power is always the solution at the end.
Right. So a couple years later, in April 1975, the RAF, they actually laid siege to the German embassy in Stockholm, and they took some hostages and they demanded a prisoner exchange. And it's important to note here that this wasn't just any prisoner exchange. This was to exchange for the main RAF folks, Baader, Enslin, Meinhof, and some others. And the RAF members, here who took over that German embassy in Stockholm, they were part of and this part is a little fuzzy for me, they're either part of the second or the third generation of these RAF members. So at least one generation removed from the originals. And, after this Stockholm standoff, the Conference of the Ministers of the Interior, or the IMK, they basically changed their tune and they gave the BKA an even bigger leadership role. This is after they already gave the BKA the authority to take control of the entire police force and shut down every road in Germany, which is crazy. And this move, basically, it undercut the decentralized structure of West Germany. And, they set up these terrorist divisions within the BKA, with more than 200 staff, which gave, Harold's team all the resources that they needed, quote unquote, to handle their job. But you can imagine, this is just I'm hearing parallels here to post 9/11 and the creation of all of these security state divisions. Same thing, exact same thing is happening here, in West Germany, albeit much smaller scale. So during the Stockholm incident, Schmidt, the chancellor, put together a crisis team that included people from all different kinds of political parties, and this became kind of a model for an unofficial group that took on one of the ruling bodies of the nation, quote unquote, during the German Autumn. We'll talk about the German Autumn in a moment here, but it was a big shift, basically, and it strengthened the executive branch and centralized power, in West Germany during all these crises. And one way that they centralized that state power was, it played out through the use of a, quote, dragnet. Have you ever heard of a dragnet before in policing, Henry?
Yeah.
So I actually didn't know this. I think this was one of the earlier uses of a dragnet.
There was a show called Dragnet.
Exactly. So since the RAF was causing all kinds of trouble in Germany, even after they had arrested all of the main original members, Harold came up with a plan to track them down. And in '79, the RAF was they were known to be renting some apartments in Frankfurt using fake names. And the cops had no clue where to find them, but they figured out that the terrorists probably paid their electricity bill with cash, since they couldn't use a bank account because they were terrorists, right? So there were about, 18,000 cash-paying electricity customers in that area at that time. And the police needed to find basically 2 terrorists out of 18,000 customers. And so what they did was they came up with this idea of cross-referencing and eliminating names off of that 18,000 list based on legal names. So they were looking at a registry of birth certificates, and saying, okay, this is a real name, we can cross them off the list. This is a real name, we can cross them off the list. And basically narrow down that 18,000 list to only a few people who were using fake names. And, they used all kinds of different databases, to basically whittle down the list to just a couple. And, they used things like registered residents, car owners, pensioners, anyone else whose name was legally registered somewhere. And this couldn't have happened without the centralization of the state, right? Again, getting all this data from different places, different databases, again, just sounds so much like the setting up of our, security state post 9/11 to let these organizations talk to each other and share information. And they print out the list of, the smaller whittled down list that they believed only had fake names. And, the police had to manually go through and cross check it with other data. But eventually they found, the apartments where the terrorists were hiding, and they caught one of them, Heisler, after they discovered his fake name. And I don't know, it's a pretty ingenious way to track down terrorists, especially in the 70s. You got to give Harold some credit here. That was fucking smart. But yeah, I mean, talk about Commissar Computer, right? So that's one way that centralization really played out, centralization of power in the state. Now, and in 1977, the RAF basically had given up on their whole strategic program of fighting against the power, and basically their entire MO at this point on was just trying to get their comrades busted out of jail. Scholars called this time period the, quote, free the guerrilla phase. And it wasn't a really good look for them. It went from bad to worse when they ended up assassinating Attorney General Siegfried Bubak, his driver, and another civil servant in an effort to break, more of their comrades out of jail. And if you've seen the movie for the Baader Meinhof complex, this scene is actually really nuts. They're like walking this fake baby carriage in front of a car. And the car has to stop real fast because they're like, oh shit, it's a baby carriage. And they pull out this just most ridiculously large looking machine gun out of it, and they just mow everyone down inside the car. It's a ridiculous scene. But this time was a really low point in the RAF, and it showed just like how far from their ideological start that they had fallen. Another issue was they tried to kidnap a guy named Jürgen Ponto, and he was the chairman of the Dresdner Bank, but they fucked that job up, and they end up killing him in his house, which wasn't a brilliant move. And all of these actions just started making things worse for the RAF. Prior to this, there was a lot of public support for RAF, and maybe not necessarily support, but like most people understood them. They're like, yeah, you're just fighting against Nazis, right? Now they're just randomly killing people in their homes, and that's not a great look. And so the Chancellor and Helmut Schmidt, they were looking to take a tough stance against this terrorism, and there was a lot of pressure from the government to do something much more aggressive to stop them. That opposition party, the Union, they demanded that the government draw a clear line between the protests and basically what amounts to terror. And shit really hit the fan when the RAF decided that they wanted to kidnap a guy named Hans Martin Schleyer. And this is basically when the German Autumn kicks off. Now, German Autumn was from September to October of 1977. And it was basically marked by a bunch of different events, primarily the kidnapping and murder of Hans Martin Schleyer and the hijacking of the Lufthansa passenger plane by members of the PFLP. So Schleyer, this dude, he was a pretty big deal in West Germany. He was the, quote, double president of two of the country's top employer associations, and he was also a TV personality, so he was very well known. Schleyer was also a former member of the SS and played a role during the Nazi occupation of Prague, so he was a total shitbag. And the RAF had hoped to use him as a bargaining chip to get the Baader Meinhof gang out of prison and also drum up some cause for their support. The PLFP, who was run by Haddad, was involved in the planning of the attack and even gave the Schleyer kidnappers the weapons that they used to actually kidnap him. But Schmidt the chancellor didn't take the bait, and he refused to let the prisoners out, even though they definitely kidnapped this dude. And, this was different from, a previous kidnapping in 1975, where they were able to make an exchange for a CDU politician who, had been taken by the RAF affiliated, movement. But I don't know, it was a real mess, when they picked up Schleyer, and it wasn't going very well for anyone. And after 3 weeks of basically no progress, Haddad, the PLFP guy, he basically proposed two new terrorist ideas to the RAF to put some more pressure on the government. They either wanted to take hostages by attacking the German embassy in Kuwait, or by hijacking a Lufthansa plane flying from Mallorca to Frankfurt. And, the RAF leadership didn't want to attack the embassy because they already tried that in Stockholm and it didn't work so well. So they just decided, hey, let's go for the plane hijacking. And so on October 13th, 1977, a 4-man commando group from the PLFP hijacked that Lufthansa plane, and they called themselves Martyr Halima, and they were honoring, a German terrorist named Brigitte Kuhlmann, who had been killed in one of those hostage rescue situations by the Israeli forces in Entebbe some time ago. Anyway, that's more of an interesting point. This Landshut plane was taken to Larnaca in Cyprus before they ultimately had to go and refuel in Rome. And then they tried to demand for the release of those prisoners, Baader and Ensslin and Meinhof. But they didn't get it still. Schmidt didn't do anything about it. And then the plane was allowed to continue to Lebanon, but it ended up getting redirected to Dubai because the airports were closed. And, while they were in Dubai, the hostages were suffering from terrible conditions and super high temperatures. And, they basically had to placate the terrorists by fixing the power to the plane and the air conditioning. And that enabled them to fly the plane again to Aden, where the captain was shot, and they had to make an emergency landing. And finally, the plane was taken to Mogadishu, where the kidnappers demanded again the release of the RAF prisoners, or they threatened to blow up the plane. Now, at the time in Somalia, they're in a military tiff with Ethiopia. We've talked about this in different episodes, and they wanted weapons from Western countries, but they were denied this until this Landshut hijacking. They were friendly with the Palestinians, so maybe that's why they let the plane, land there in the first place. But basically all the other countries had been turning it away. Anyway, this whole saga ends not with letting the terrorists out of jail. On October 18th, the GSG-9, which is a German special forces unit, and the British SAS, they teamed up for Operation Fire Magic to rescue the hostages, and they approached the plane from 3,000 meters out. Got on both sides of the plane and stormed it. They opened all 6 doors up of the Landshut and took control of it and freed the hostages. During the mission, the leader, the terrorist leader, got shot, and he fell between the 2 pilot seats, and one of the other terrorists ended up getting shot through the door of a toilet. It's a shitty place to die, quite literally. Thankfully they threw a hand grenade, but it was a dummy, so no one got hurt. And all of the hostages were taken off the plane and led to an area where they can be safe, and the mission was a total success, and the hostages were finally free. But the RAF members weren't. They were in jail still. And this is the crazy part that I'm going to gloss over a little bit because we're kind of running low on time. But the very next day, all of the main RAF members were found dead in their cells. And the story around this is, the official story is that they committed suicide, but there is, of course, a more nefarious story that goes underneath it that talks about just the isolation that the German government had put them through, and the different torture methods that they had used on them, and that they were suicided instead of actually committing suicide. But maybe that could be another story for another day.
Well, let's ask our Lord and Savior, ChatGPT. let's see what this says. Did RAF kill themselves?
Let's see what it says.
Did RAF kill themselves? I don't know if it's going to get what I'm saying. Okay. The question is not clear.
Is it right? The Red Army faction or West German
faction kill themselves?
It is still a matter of debate and controversy as to whether the deaths were actually suicides or whether they were murdered by the authorities, as some people believe that the government have played a role in their deaths. However, it is generally accepted that the members of the RAF who died in prison did so by their own hands. I don't know. I'm unconvinced. I read quite a few reports that suggest otherwise, but I don't know.
Mine
Up
says,
to you guys.
Yes, members of the Red Army faction, also known as Baader Meinhof group, did commit suicide. So this one makes no notion of the foul play. I don't know. It sounds like they were probably murdered. I don't buy it. Whenever convenient murders happen like that, like, it's better off that they die.
Yeah.
You always kind of think that they were suicided. And that's the end. And that's, unfortunately, well, I mean, I guess they were terror groups and they were violent. So you meet the end that you make. But, yeah, that's what happens when you resort to terrorism. You're probably going to die.
Yep.
You're most likely going to get murdered, killed by the state.
Right.
So don't do it. Is this a good time to mention that we don't endorse any political violence? I think that's a perfect time.
Yep.
So Bro History does not endorse political violence. And
of any kind.
If you get into that, you're most likely going to die.
Right.
So to end this episode, that's the moral of this 3-part series in the Red Army faction. Don't do political violence. I asked a couple of questions about how you could help our podcast, and the number one way to help our podcast right now is filling out that SurveyMonkey survey. It's in the show notes. You got to just choose Bro History when you're going to the questionnaire. You can win $500. Well, Amazon dollars, but that's worth something, right?
Yeah.
You probably buy everything on Amazon anyway.
Right.
I asked our Lord and Savior, ChatGPT, filling out a SurveyMonkey. Well, I asked the question, will filling out a SurveyMonkey survey make you more attractive? And it said, filling out a SurveyMonkey survey is unlikely to directly make you more attractive, as a physical appearance and personality traits tend to be the primary factors that influence one's level of attractiveness. However, completing a survey could potentially make you more appealing to the survey sender.
Fair enough.
Particularly
if
they are gathering feedback. So, you heard it. So fill out the SurveyMonkey survey. It is very helpful for this show's growth. It's imperative for this show's growth. And you may win $500 in Amazon dollars. Anything
and everybody
else to
likes $500.
filling out a SurveyMonkey survey?
Nah.
Okay. And make sure your feedback's positive. I'm joking.
Right.
Be honest. And just fill out your accurate demographic information. It will help us. It will help us sell you items. Okay, let's wrap this up. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Bro History. It is the number one way to support our show. You can also rate and review the podcast and join us on Patreon. That is another way to support our show. But fill out that SurveyMonkey survey. All right, I'm going to stop before you guys hate me. Should we wrap this one up for good?
Yeah, man.
All right, peace.
Peace.
Welcome to the future in this year's wildest super fun show for adults.
Hey gang, it's Josh Olson. And Joe Dante.
And we want to tell you about our podcast. It's about movies.
Josh, there are 1,000 podcasts about movies.
Sure, but ours is different, Joe.
That's true, actually. Our guests are writers, directors, musicians, comedians, actors.
Hell, we even have other podcasters on.
We play no favorites, and they don't talk so much about their own work, but about the movies that have influenced them and made them who they are. We call it The Movies That Made Me.
We've talked with people like Guillermo del Toro, Little Stevie Van Zandt, Martin Short, Ethan Hawke, William Friedkin, Barbara Crampton, Jonathan Ross, Dennis Lehane, Mark Duplass, Adam McKay, Lorraine Newman, Jason Reitman, Alison Anders, Elijah Wood, Stephen Canals, Eli Roth, Joe Bob Briggs, Roger Corman, Bobcat Goldthwait, Leon Douglas, Dana Gould, Martin Campbell, Shane Black, Albert Hughes, Emily Deschanel, Joe Biafra, Ari Fessenden, Nicole Housen, Shaka King, Lee Daniels, Rosalind Chow, Clancy Brown, Yardley Smith, Ike Arnold, Steve Arquette, Thomas Middleton, Gina Prince Lightfoot, and Uwe Boll.
It may not be highbrow, but it's lots of fun.
Subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts.
In color to thrill you as never before.